Hey everyone, Pastor George here with our episode of A New Thing. Excited to be here with all of you this morning, and we're talking about Christians being cool today. Isn't that exciting? I bet you didn't expect to think about that. So I'm going to talk about it. This is actually something I think is really interesting. I'm going to call it Christian Chic is what I'll call it, because it's reminding me of something else that I've read before. Although what we're going to be looking at is much more glowing than the other thing I've read. All right, so firstly, we're going to start off with our Bible verse. So here we go. This is from Luke 6:43 through 45. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. So I think this is really good and important because it sums up my attitude towards an article that I recently read, but also helpful advice just generally, obviously. We actually looked at this passage in Bible study last night with young adults. But this is what I read right here. It's from the Christian Science Monitor, which I don't know if they're actually affiliated with Christian Science anymore, which is a cult. There's a little thing at the top. Why is Christian Science in our name? That's interesting. I don't want to click on it because I don't want to lose the story, but I'll check that out later, I guess. In any case, it's kind of unimportant because it's a article with this title: Rebels with a Religious Cause Meet New York's Avant-Garde Conservatives. And it's an article that's all about this movement, this artistic movement that started up in New York City a few years ago, where a lot of the people who are kind of the heads of it, who are running it, who are kind of making a name for themselves on the internet, are all people who identify with religious affiliation, especially very traditional religious affiliation. So this is going to give you a little of a start here, right? So it says Salome slides her svelte figure through a cracked open door near the front of the dark sanctuary. Click clack. It's the first moment of the vigil of the Easter Church of the Most Holy Redeemer in Manhattan's East Village. Worshippers at this historic Catholic church can only hear her stiletto heels faint and staccato as she walks to its organ. She steps carefully up the old stone heaps to the console, flicking on a reading light that illuminates her sharp features. As more parishioners walk in, she begins to play a mournful introduction, marking the last moments of Lent in what is now a quiet cacophony of footsteps. This is the organist's sixth gig in 4 days during Holy Week, which she says is kind of a fashion week for Catholics. A classically trained musician, she is also an artist and model. Earlier this year at an uptown literary ball, she walked a runway for Elena Velez, a well-known designer who's been called the enfant terrible of the fashion world, modeling her controversial Gone with the Wind-inspired clothing line during the actual New York Fashion Week. And so it talks about how this church is now, it's in a place that's very, it uses the word bohemian, right? So, like, very, where kind of young, poor, but starving artist types kind of hang out. And so, this is kind of the whole situation where this is happening. And then she says, it goes on to describe the area. It says, the neighborhood may long have since been gentrified, but Salome, her confirmation name turned celebrity mononym, has been part of a new cadre of young New York artists who have been raging against a different cause, the cultural rot and decadence brought about by libtards, in quotes. That's a way that people who are online will typically refer to left-leaning people, right? Obviously, it's disparaging. I'm sure you can tell what two words that is put together. I don't need to be the one to tell you that. And then she says, leftists see greatness and they see beauty and they're threatened by it and they want to destroy it, says Salome, who says the Tridentine Mass is, quote, the greatest work of art, unquote, for its superior musical composition. For those who, this is an interesting thing to say for several reasons. I will say I have to think about it a little bit. But the Tridentine Mass, just to explain to you, is the pre-Vatican II Council of Trent Mass, which is all done in Latin with the priest facing away from the people, speaking only in Latin, things like that. And she says superior musical composition. From what I understand, is actually the Mass can be arranged in a lot of different music. So I'm not sure what she means by that, or whatever. She is an interesting thing to say here, because we're going to talk about what goes on in the next paragraph. Originally from Philadelphia, Salome has been a devout Catholic since she was young. She wears a Make America Great Again hat around town, sometimes as an act of ironic defiance. And even though she's transgender, she prefers the term of an earlier age, castrato. Castrato were singers, male singers, who I actually don't know if this is true, because I just haven't done the research. This seems like it would be fake, but I don't know the history of music well enough. But there supposedly were male singers who were castrated in order to keep their high voice. So, because they didn't allow women to sing in choirs. So, like when boys were, before they would hit puberty, they would be castrated so the testosterone wouldn't mess up their voices and they could keep their high voice for the whole of their life. I don't know if that's true. But this is what she then says. She says, but first and foremost, I'm a Catholic. She says she's a child of God. I'm just a Catholic here. I sort of refuse to identify myself with any other label, gender, sexuality, political. Salome says, I'm Catholic and I'm an artist. And so because I'm an artist, I'm interested in all ideas. And I happen to have been born in a time when that is not okay. All right. So if you're like me, you may have read this and been of I don't want to say even two minds, but confused. So it starts off by describing a mass, a Catholic church, right? And someone praising traditional values, things like that, and then revealing themselves to be transgender. You don't usually see that combination here. And I think, and obviously there is a huge gap in between what the Catholic Church teaches on that issue, which is, that there is no such thing, and then of course someone's personal kind of own belief about it. But then you also see that there's this element of rebellion, right? The fact that Salome's wearing around this Make America Great Again hat around town. And obviously in New York, that's not a popular thing to do. That shouldn't be that surprising. But Salome identifies primarily as Catholic. And so it's very interesting to see the what I would call the disparity between those two positions. And so basically the rest of the article goes on to describe how a bunch of people in Dime Square, young New Yorkers, creative people, are using religion and traditional values as a way to rebel against the system. Hence, you have rebels with a religious cause, right? And what's interesting is, obviously, there's a little bit more craftsmanship, a lot, I would say, better art generally. But to me, it's not too much of a difference between these two things, right? So like we call these boomer memes because they're shared by, older people on Facebook. But like, there's not really too much of a difference in terms of substance sometimes between this and like what these people are doing. Obviously in terms of art and style and class, this is a lot higher. Because they're talking about, poetry readings and starting magazines and and performing plays and making films and all these other sorts of like high art type of things. And obviously this is just a bad Photoshop. But it's both getting at this same idea of being transgressive against the current establishment that the culture is putting out, right? And that's pretty important. And so it goes on to describe a bunch of different ways that it is. But one of the things that I think is interesting is what is the big thing here? What do the people in the article talk about? And I heavily recommend you do read this article. I'm going to put it in the description because it's just interesting. There's two ways. There's the deep read, which is definitely worth reading. I like how they tell you how long it's going to take you if you read it, I guess, at a normal pace, 16 minutes. And then you have a quick read, which is just a few paragraphs. So you can kind of get the essence of it even in that. But there's really interesting kind of things going on here, right? So it talks about a podcast. This is a podcast that is pretty famous. I have friends who've listened to it, who know these women who run it. So it says the podcast Red Scare. It's called Red Scare because I don't think the author tells us here, but basically Dasha Nekrasova and Anna, I can't say this Armenian last name, Kachian or something, are both from like Soviet backgrounds in the sense that like their families they were either born in the Soviet Union when they were really young and came to the United States, or their families were kind of from there and then they were raised here. And so anyway, it was among the first to popularize the term dime square, associated with the dirtbag left, a term that described zealous Bernie Sanders supporters who eschewed civility and prioritized disruption. The hosts later became disillusioned by the movement and explored the ideas of the new right, the Donald Trump-led movement that also stands against neoliberalism, which is kind of this idea of primarity of democracy and spreading democracy around the globe, right? Global capitalism and corporate hegemony. Their guests have included people such as Steve Bannon and Alex Jones, and I'm sure, very connected to the Trump administration, conspiracy theorist, right? Miss Nekrasova is also a devout Catholic, even if she likes to quip Catholic like Andy Warhol. So Andy Warhol, obviously a famous artist, and was a Catholic, Eastern Catholic, and he would commonly attend Mass and do all other sorts of things, which wasn't really well known at his time. He didn't really publicize that. It kind of came out after he died. But anyway, an actor who had a recurring role, this is referring to Dasha, popular HBO series Succession. She's hosted podcasts on obscure theological topics. People accuse me of being a fascist or cultural conservative, she says. I actually feel more like a degenerate artistically. I'm a free speech absolutist. So this is really important. This idea, right? I'm a free speech absolutist, which is really, I agree with that. I would say I'm a free speech absolutist too. I'm really big on that. Both she and Ms. Kachayan have outspoken against what they see as godless politics of the left. No hell, no dignity, Ms. Nekrasova once said. I actually agree with that too. I believe if there is no punishment for bad things, then justice is kind of a mockery. So it's a radical statement, but I think it's true. But you can see here what I really think is important is you have this meaning of religious ideas, which I think some come from a good place, but also this idea of this being the place to be free, right? You had that earlier quote from Salome about not being able to not do anything, like the culture tells you not to do stuff, things like that. And it goes on to say, talking about this whole group, it says they play the church organ rather than DJ at nightclubs. Instead of free love and polyamory, they espouse commitment and monogamy. And the flip phone is a favorite accessory, a statement against the herd and its iPhones, right? So here you get this current, the undercurrent of what's kind of going on here. And then they quote this thing from Julia Yost, who I guess is a writer, senior editor at First Things, which is a magazine. She said, traditional morality acquired a transgressive glamour. Disaffection with the progressive moral majority combined with Catholicism's historic ability to accommodate cultural subversion has produced an in-your-face style of traditionalism. And I think that I would I would challenge that claim as a Protestant a little bit. I do not think the Catholic Church has historically accommodated cultural subversion. So just my own 2 cents. Maybe in countries where it's a minority, it's done that. But it's produced an in-your-face style of traditionalism. This is not your grandmother's church, and whether the new faithful are performing an act of theater or not, they have a chance to revitalize the church for young, educated Americans. So I think this is very much a movement, obviously, that is elite. I don't mean that necessarily in the sense of being wealthy, although that might be, possible. but the idea that this is for the intellectual elite or for the artistic elite and things like that, this is not something that the average American is really going to vibe with. And I think they like that. That's kind of the excitement of it, right? The idea of being able to be on the outside and be a rebel is very exciting, especially in the United States. And I think particularly exciting for people from conservative backgrounds who, for a long time, have been told that there is no way they can feel that way. But now, with the positions in the country switching, they are. And I think that's actually sometimes hard for other people to understand. Because there is a truth to what's going on here. Like, this is a radical thing to do in New York City, which is a very progressive place, right? So I don't want to say that this is all wrong. Like, this is actually true. Wearing a Make America Great Again hat around New York City is actually a very transgressive thing to do. It just is. It'd be the same thing if you wore it at Princeton or something, right? It puts a target on you. So I'm not saying that they're wrong about that. What my concern with this is that there is a emphasis. So they talk a lot about this idea of being rebels, right? There's not a ton about theology, and that might be because just the writer of this article is not focusing on that. It's very possible, but I also know that it's very likely that this could very well be a veneer that's just covering. They're using religion as a way to cover, and I'm not saying they don't like it. They might like it, and I'm sure they do. I'm not saying. I'm sure they enjoy that idea, and I'm not saying their faith is fake or anything like that. But I believe that what is taking priority here is this idea of being a rebel, and that's why I selected this verse, because how I am taking this is I need to see the fruit. Right, I need to see the fruit of where this is going, and what's been come of it. And I would say for me, it's too soon to really tell. I think the article says it's been going on since like 2022, so it's been 1.5, 2 years, whatever. And so for me, it's like, I can't judge this whole movement based on just one article and a few years of time. If it's going to produce works of art or produce fruit, we have to wait for that to see. What are these people going to do later in life? Things like that. But also, I'm not calling it evil, but I like what Jesus says here, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of, right? We give voice to what's most important to us. And one of the things, I don't know I can't remember if the writer of this article talks about it. He mentions Ken Kesey here. He talks about a writer, Mr. Castro, who's in the district, and he says he's like a Christian Ken Kesey with a neck tattoo of Ohio, his home state. And so this reminded me a lot. This whole movement reminded me a ton of the Beat Generation. So the Beat Generation was in the 50s, and basically before the hippies, kind of this group of writers, especially, but other artists, who were in New York and kind of pushing boundaries and being transgressive and all these other sort of thing. It never was as popular as the hippie movement, which caught on with the wider culture in a way that these guys didn't. But I remember I took a class on the Beat Generation in high school where I had to read Allen Ginsberg, who I think that is on the left, and Jack Kerouac, who I think is sitting in the middle. I'm not sure who this guy on the right is. And I also had to read Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey's a little after the Beat Generation. He's like in between. I think there's a quote from him that was like, I was too young to be a beat and too old to be a hippie. But he wrote, you might not know the name, but you definitely probably know his most famous work, which is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was turned into a movie starring Jack Nicholson. And so this is high praise from this writer, right? He says this Castro guy is like a Christian Ken Kesey with a neck tattoo of Ohio. And I think what he says about literature is true, right? The best kind of literature reveals aspects of life or reality or the psyche or the soul that can reveal those things in sort of unique and compelling ways. And he wrote a book that's received glowing reviews. And this is all about him reading to people and in like, kind of like a coffee house type vibe where people are sitting around snapping, that sort of thing. And he says, true monogamy and traditional Christianity are the last taboos to many. says Mr. Castro, who fell in love with the Eastern Orthodox liturgy. So again, a very conservative or traditional tradition, and converted a few years ago. He explains how true faith and love freed him from moral rot in a past life consumed by heroin addiction, which this is great. Love that for him. I'm glad he got that. This is why I don't doubt conviction, because if it's able to break him from that, that's great. But you also see there's this emphasis on the artistic side, where to me, the artistic part of any tradition is always a secondary cause. You'll see lots of people convert to certain things because they like the aesthetics. I care about truth, which is why I couldn't really, nothing against Eastern Orthodox or Catholic, but why I couldn't, because I just don't think that they teach true things all the time. And so he explains how true faith and love freed him from moral rot. That's great. He says, I strive to be undistracted. Christianity has taught me to pay attention to the important things. I love Jesus, man, especially when he's ranting at the spoiled temple in John. So again, I don't doubt this whole thing. But he goes on to say this. He says, trad culture, so traditional culture, is not bad for you. Again, traditional here should be in quotes, because often what we think is traditional is really not. History is complicated. But what he's basically speaking about here is older values in the United States. Conservative views of sexuality, gender, morality, that sort of thing. Trad culture is not bad for you. Neither is having an objective standard of meaning and not wanting to sleep with 10,000 people. Hey, I agree, right? This is true. You should have an objective standard of meaning. Most of us don't, or especially people outside of the church, right? They struggle to define that in conversation. And of course, not wanting to sleep with 10,000 people is also a good thing. And they continue to talk about this aspect. I think that when people get rid of a transcendent standard of meaning, get rid of a sort of idea of truth that we can all agree on, something that sort of transcends our own individual whims or preferences, I think when you get rid of that power, it's just your will versus my will, which is absolutely true. This is exactly right. So I'm not gonna do that. But again, we get back to this idea of this being a artistic and political movement, and mainly like a anti status quo type thing. So a general vibe in Dime Square is that no ideas are off limits, a reaction to what many artists see as the stifling censorship of the left-wing cancel culture. The Salon at Sovereign House has hosted speakers such as Steve Saylor, a far-right thinker in the past. In the past, Mr. Saylor has said black people possess poorer native judgment than members of better educated groups and need moral guidance from society. But the Underground Salon in Chinatown has also included a number of religiously conservative artists and thinkers. And so you can see where the difficulty is here, right? He quotes Alex Jones, this one guy, Adubato, and he says, Alex Jones, who I by no means am a fan of, but he said that this thing kind of stuck with me, and it's kind of true. He's like, do you want to go to a house party that's with liberal people or conservative people? If you go to a liberal party this day, it's like, you can't say this, you can't say that. It's going to be subdued. No one can be offensive. So who do you want to party with? So the interesting thing here is you see this emphasis on free speech and freedom of thought that's there, which is interesting because I imagine most people would not associate religion with that. I don't think that's wrong necessarily, and I don't even think his premise here is wrong. I do think that, again, though, what this is about is to people, it's like, how do we challenge kind of the status quo, or how do we set ourselves apart in kind of a way that might be, self aggrandizing, in the way that lots of these movements can be, like the hippie movement or the beat movement or hipsters or whatever else you want to talk about. A way to think, oh, I'm so much smarter and better than all the sheep who use iPhones, that sort of thing, right? He reads a short story about a blue-haired liberal getting owned by a believer in the Almighty. Again, this is why I say the difference between this and this is probably just style sometimes. And so He says people are tired of pure secularism. I'm seeing more people drawn to organized religion, whether it's Catholicism or branches of Protestantism or Islam or Judaism, because there's something a little more concrete about the promises that practicing these religions gives you. When you go to a church, it's very clear about what's being asked of you, and you can share that path with other people. We want that. We want to be together. We want to understand what our lives are for. We don't want this vagueness anymore. So I do think that this is actual response to something that's happening in the culture and with young people. I actually am convinced of this based on my own experience of friends, my own, I guess, ministry or time spent with people who are in these locations and think this way. This is true. Like, there is a vagueness or a lack of clarity about what the purpose of life is for many people, and a lot of people do not buy what has been kind of put forward in the past of being like, well, it's about having a wife and kids and a home or whatever, for lots of reasons. And so I think religion has an opportunity, right, as the church especially has an opportunity to speak deeply into the lives of people. But, that also comes with young people generally wanting to be on the outside and be kind of different, which is also why I think it's not just any churches that they're going to, even though a lot of churches will have the same kind of standards when it comes to traditional values or whatever. It's about going to these really obscure, not even 1% of the population of the United States type religions, right? Very small groups. So this keeps going. I believe that this is Salome again. Oh, Audrey Horn. This is Audrey Horn. She says, I kind of grew an audience through fighting people online and telling people how lonely I was and just being brutally honest. People respond to that in a really unprecedented way. And then she's now a non-denominational Christian, right? Which I guess kind of goes against my point because that's like the most popular one. She said she listened to Red Scare, that it made her move from Seattle to the East Coast. And she's kind of found a place here among all these other people. But I wanted to go down to here where it's at the bottom. So it talks about a guy, Mr. Vickery, he says, despite being gay himself, Mr. Vickery says gay men are not really part of this intersectional identity. We're different historically. He says that he doesn't like that gay men are associated with LGBT because he says they're different, which I would agree with that. I would say all of these are different, so it's wrong to kind of put them all together. I think the reason that artists here are socially conservative, or at least they pretend to be, he's the first one who's kind of says, pretend to be in this kind of punk element, is because they don't want to be told what to do and what to make and what not to say. And that really, I think, sums up this thing, because you have two strands that are working together now because they're both countercultural. The ability to kind of say and do whatever you say, even or whatever you want, even if it offends people, and like traditional conservative morality. And these things are kind of running in parallel right now. Because both are on the outside. And so this group of people at Dime Square, and this is interesting, right, have created a counterculture out of being religious and mixing these two things together, even if what the religions teach and their own personal lives don't match up. It's very interesting. But it reminded me of this article, which I think I've talked about before, but I'm going to talk about it again. So this is an article by Tom Wolfe, and it was published back in 1970. And it's called Radical Chic, That Party at Lenny's. So it's all about a party that Leonard Bernstein, who was a conductor in New York, a famous classical conductor, had a party at his house where he invited a bunch of his super wealthy elite friends to come meet Black Panthers. And it's this really funny article. And I guess I'll also put this down in the thing, because it's basically because the artist, the guy who wrote this, Tom Wolfe, is there, and he's there not really to participate but to write about it. And you kind of get to see all of these people who think that being radical is cool, being different is cool. Like, this is the cool thing to do, even if they don't really understand what's going on and like the Black Panthers are kind of just taking advantage of the generosity that they get, because they get the idea of being like, oh, we're on the in with this because we're down with the cause, right? And you can even see they kind of have this free Leonard Bernstein, they're doing the Black Power pose with the gloves and things like that. This is meant to make fun of them. And this article is very tongue-in-cheek about this whole thing. And that's kind of how I feel about this in some ways, in that we have to wait and see, like Jesus is telling me here with the with tree and fruit, right? I want to see what the fruit of this is. It could be good, right? Like the Beat Generation, disagree with a lot of them, but they made good art, some of them, right? And so like we can't just say it's all bad. Like there is good things to come out of it. It might be that the people who are writing and making movies and things like that create some good stuff, and we should appreciate that if it happens. But I think what's interesting is we also have to be aware of those inconsistencies. And do we say, or can we be tempted, oh, Christianity is cool now because it's been taken up by these artist bohemian types in New York City? Or is it going to end up being something like this, where it only appears radical, but in the end, it's, not really that big of a deal or important? I think the way we navigate this is by taking our time and thinking about it, like Jesus is telling us here, and also not saying or not selling people Christianity as it's countercultural, right? I mean, that might be an attraction to some people, and I'm not going to say it's wrong. Christianity is countercultural, but we also should demand out of people, like they said, like a way of living that's consistent. And there is a lot of inconsistencies here, right? That I think are really important to point out and kind of navigate. But I just found this so interesting because it's like Christianity is cool again. Of course, we'll see where that goes, but you rarely see stuff like this written. So I thought it was worth talking about and thinking about this morning as I began my Thursday with all of you. So I hope you guys found this a little bit interesting. I will see you guys on Sunday for worship. I hope you guys have a great Thursday. Peace out.